Haydn Shaw, thanks for being on the show with us.
I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah. So, a bit of background on you. I came to know about your work just through searching generational dynamics in the workplace. And I came across your book, Sticking Points,
Mhm.
which you had recently revised and now includes a whole bunch of information about Gen Z as they're coming into the workforce. But you break down 12 points on
And
where
ignore Gen Z.
yeah, no, they want the attention for sure. But you broke down a lot of these different areas in which generational perspectives cause us to have hangups and frustrations. And so I'm curious to know more about your professional background and what brought you to this subject of expertise.
Let me talk about hangouts for just a moment. When we were, I ran the title "Sticking Points" past some people, and somebody said, "Oh, I don't like it. Makes me think of walking around outside some downtown somewhere. It's really hot, and the clothes you're wearing start sticking to you." And I said, "Well, that's actually exactly what it is." Some people have used other more expansive terms, especially collision, generations
Mm,
colliding, and I don't think they collide as much as they just stick in places. Whether it's gross, like I'm sticky, so my my top or shirt is sticking, or if it's we, as you said, we pass by each other,
mm,
and it just there's hitches. There's
mm,
there's places where it's not frictionless, and so
mm.
that's really where you just nailed it in your introduction. That's where sticking points comes from. It comes from this idea that we're not lobbing weaponry at each other. We're we're just trying to do our job, and we keep bumping into things.
Mm.
and,
Often,
and for me, that came out of both the experience of bumping in to older
mm,
generations. I had a work situation early in my career where I had a manager dress me down in social services. Had a manager literally dress me down in front of the paid team as well as volunteers, and and it was about generational differences. He thought it was about me being inadequate. And it was so clearly generational difference between
mm,
traditionalists and baby boomers, or in my case, Gen Xers. That he, but so it was a very real experience for me to run into a fairly big friction. But more than that, when I was an entrepreneur and trying to impact, and I led nonprofits, while trying to impact people. Well, the baby boomers were the newer decision makers at the time, and they were so different than the traditionalists that people didn't know what to do with them. They dropped out of organizations rather than joined, and so that was
mm.
stunning. So there was a lot of research on generations that I began to pay attention to until I began to dig in and do my own significant research about 10 years after that.
Wow. One thing I often talk about, especially with my young boy, is we need to be kind and appropriate with each other. And sometimes when he's being ornery, we'll be walking next to each other, and he will deliberately step on my heel and try to get my foot out of my shoe. We call it giving each other a flat tire. And
I have heard it. I have had family members accuse me of flat tiring them.
yeah, so tell me more about. Let's set the stage.
Well, I think that's a
In
really good metaphor for
mm,
it. Sometimes we inadvertently give each other a flat tire. Some of the things the baby boomers especially have said about millennials led to Pew Research discovering that a third of all millennials who are older tried to label themselves Gen X just so they couldn't be millennials. In the book, I talk about this woman who said to me, "It is so true. My 32-year-old husband said that he was Gen X," and I said, "How? No, there's no way." He goes, "Yeah, I'm Gen X. I did an online survey on Facebook and it said I'm Gen X." She goes, "You could not be any more millennial than trying to avoid being a millennial by doing a Facebook online survey. You are so millennial, you can't even find out what your designation is any less millennial than super millennial. I was like, I just couldn't stop laughing.
Yeah, well,
But it's because us boomers, sorry, allergies, it's because us boomers were just so hateful
hmm,
and made such strong statements. So sometimes we heal each other, give each other a flat tire because we do it on purpose. But other times it's just the sticking points of bumping into somebody that we have to work with closely. And a sticking point is when we both answer the same question differently and then are surprised because we assume those answers are obvious.
hmm. One
And the
thing I've
reason we answer
learned,
them differently is we were raised in different eras and have different
hmm,
assumptions. Or the cutting edge of generational research is life stage. We're in a different life stage, and we either don't know what's coming next in the life stage, we dismiss it, or we forgot what that life stage was about when we went through it.
hmm. The idea of dismissing, that is very interesting to me because as I went through the MBA program at Utah State, the biggest takeaway I got from that entire experience was that there are going to be positions and niches within an organization where you don't necessarily have to be the technician. You don't have to know all, you don't need to be the subject matter expert, but you do need someone that can talk across interest groups and make sure we're all moving in the same direction. And so there are plenty of layers to this, and generations is and life
Just
stages.
one
These are
layer.
two very important things. But one thing that has become so apparent to me in my professional career so far is that there are plenty of people who will, for one reason or another, dismiss something that they think, well, there's just one right answer and it's mine, and anything else is just an annoyance to dismiss. So help us understand, why does this come up, generationally speaking, or life stage speaking?
Our brains edit.
Hmm.
It's too much to focus on, right? So our brains begin to edit things. My wife just sent me a text that popped up on my screen so that while I was looking in the camera, I still peeked over and saw that she has COVID.
Wow.
The advantage of giving her a test that was out, that it expired, is that it showed a negative. So we felt really good about that. Then when she felt worse, she wanted somebody to pop over to the store and get her a fresh one. And unfortunately, a good one that wasn't expired actually told us the truth.
Hmm.
So we tend to do that. We tend to use expired information, or we tend to screen things out, or, I have to tell you, for a moment, I focus less on our interaction and more on, oh, wow, what are the implications of COVID?
Sure.
Because our brains edit. Our brains are constantly trying to save calories and edit things down. And
Hmm.
so we work off of rules of thumb. And we work off of statistical models.
Hmm.
If we've seen 47 people who are in leadership in a particular age range and they have relatively similar behaviors, we project that out and assume that that sample's big enough to make a generalization. And in the book, I point out, what Sherlock, a great line in a Sherlock Holmes story where he basically said, in the mass, the numbers are always right. With individuals, they're very misleading. And
Hmm.
so generational research is based on large statistical models that generalize the data. But you apply any one of those generalizations that may be statistically valid over a large group of people, you apply them to the three people that you work with, and they could be wildly afar from the truth.
Hmm.
When we take generalizations and apply them to individuals, we're actually stereotyping, but we're using valid information to stereotype.
Yeah. In psychology, we call these rules of thumb heuristics, and there's different varieties of it, but some of which could be exemplified in saying, "Oh man, who did Dr. Phil bring on as a guest this week? And what kind of crazy teenager is showing up and getting famous on TikTok? Oh my gosh, the world is going to hell in a handbasket with this new generation." How
Yeah.
can we develop greater openness and awareness? Maybe perhaps just to simply know, oh, maybe I'm operating off outdated information.
Oh, you bet. Well, this is the thing of memes, right? And Um, but stay thirsty, my friend. Stay thirsty is now you can find that all over the internet, and and that beer brand is particularly happy for their success.
Mm,
I would paraphrase that. I would say, stay curious, my friend. Stay curious.
mm,
The only way to fight those heuristics, those mindsets that can get fixed, is to say, well, I'm curious as to why a person would do that. I would not do that. That doesn't make sense to me. But why would a person think that way, react that way, do that? I just talked to somebody earlier who said, one of my colleagues gets tired easily. Well, I'm really tired. Boy, I need a mental health day. I'm really tired. Well, this person's career started in the army, where you would have to be really sick. He goes, and
mm,
they are prone to illness, or prone to not feeling good. He goes, yeah, you would have to be, the level of physical ailment would have to be off the charts in the army for
mm,
you not to show up for duty. So he finds it very difficult to be patient
mm,
with a colleague. And the only way to do that is say, I wouldn't react that way. So let me be curious about that. Let me be curious why you're talking about leaving a month and a half after you took this job.
mm.
I would be curious. One of my millennial kids told their boss they were going to relocate to a warmer climate, and we're here in Chicago, going to relocate to a warmer climate sometime in the next year and a half, but they didn't know where or when. I'm
Okay.
like, what are you announcing that for? Well, I just wanted to be upfront and open. They asked me how things are going, and so in our one-on-ones, and then so I told my boss. My generation would never have done
Mm,
that. Never have done it. Well, the interesting thing though is when he met with this boss, she would say at lunch, she'd say, "Well, found a place yet?" It was not. It was a very different conversation than when you would have had in my world.
mm.
So I had to be
And
curious with my son. Why are you doing that? That's
right.
crazy. Keep it to yourself. They are going to treat you differently. They may even try to find something. If they find the perfect candidate, they may work you out.
Mm.
It's like, no, that's not going to happen.
That's very interesting because I very much agree with that. There can be a lot of different ways that we have to choose to communicate to make sure that we manage our relationships, we manage our reputation in the workplace, and to communicate something as you said your son did, who in someone else's ears it may sound like he doesn't know what he's doing. He's thinking of jumping ship and getting confused and uncertain. There's a lot of difference there in, well, I'm just trying to do the right thing and giving you a heads up, but it's received as this, I don't know what to think because it's so uncertain.
And what naivete it is. Matter of,
Mm.
yeah, my best friend said to me, "That's crazy." And what I've learned over the years is my daughter's not left an organization yet, but
Oh,
all
forgive me,
three
your
of
daughter.
my children who have left organizations all told their boss that in one-on-ones that they were planning to leave
Mm.
before they did it, and it clicked along quite nicely for them. The good news is they were able to read the room, but
Mm.
and the world has changed. All their bosses said, "Thank you so much for the heads up."
Well, that's nice to hear because this topic of what ultimately just means succession planning, how does this play in to how we can effectively communicate between generations?
Well, as you can imagine, there would be quite a bit of overlap in the topic and what we just discussed as the very different views. I'm going to move over. I'm going to move over a screen here
Mm.
because I think there are 7 essentials
Mm.
that will actually reduce turnover. It's stuff that any organization can do. I was having a conversation with the CEO yesterday, And he said, "Yeah, I was really interested in talking to you about some of our manufacturing plants, but our real hemorrhage is in warehouse. Will this work as well in warehousing? No, because there's some inherent things about the pay scale of warehousing and the number of competitors that were popping up where he was at that would that working to change the way we interact as people would not have cut their turnover in half. But there are things that their organization can do, and any organization can do, that's in their control, is I guess what I'm saying.
Okay. Yes. Very good. To let's set parameters around where these things will be effective. Yeah.
You bet. I have a relative that works in warehousing, and he said the funny thing is, our managers will say, "I feel so sorry for that employee that they have no one to look after their kids, but we had to fire him because they didn't show up for 2 days."
Hmm. Hmm.
So part of the reason why people turn over about every 3 months in that warehouse is the pay scale means that they, and typically their partner, if their child gets sick on a day when they're both at work, they try to find jobs that overlap their schedules typically, but if their
Hmm.
child gets sick, they have to stay home. They have no other options, and if they stay home for 2 days, they lose their job. So part of the turnover is the way the system is baked, and no one manager can do it. They're like, "We really feel sorry for that, but what are you going to do? We got to get stuff out the door." And whereas the workers who are there, they're like, they say they care about us, but how do you care about somebody if you're automatically fired if your kid gets sick? This is a
Right.
delusional job.
Hmm.
And it is. I mean, if you were doing job design, you would say, "Wow, are you on drugs when you
Sure.
design this?" And how would you dare communicate you care about the individuals? Well, the individual managers do. And so
Hmm.
I guess it's a long way of saying some jobs are inherently prone to turnover.
Hmm.
And it would take a pretty massive redefine of how things get done for that not to be the case. But there are things that we can do that will impact things. And there's some things that wouldn't stop turnover in a warehouse, but it would slow it down, for example. Would slow it down. Same thing with food service, high turnover jobs. You're not going to stop it, but you could slow it down.
Very good. Yeah. Tell us
And
during
nursing as well. Nursing, for example.
nursing. Sure.
Nursing
Plenty
is
of
the schedule. It's the schedules and
schedule.
shortage in nursing that makes nurses quit. So,
Hmm.
there's limited things that you can do, but you can always work on these things. And so 7 of them. Let me just rattle them off.
Yeah.
First of the essentials, they get told the truth about the job before they get hired.
Hmm.
I know not hiding stuff from people seems so basic, but really one of the attitudes that you battle on that is, the supervisor who's hiring thinks they wouldn't want to work here if they knew about the tougher parts. So I'm not going to tell them about the tougher parts in case they don't mind it that much.
There is so much hate fuel out there on social media about fake job listings or just, yeah, not saying what the job actually is.
I mean, there are whole streams of Reddit that are about nothing but that, especially anti-work.
Sure.
Is just one story after another. And because I follow those things, I get a lot of stories in my feed where I think to
Mm,
myself, well, of course you would leave.
right.
Yeah, that's called bait and switch.
Right. So some basic honesty up front. Good.
But the thing is, then, so I know a nurse who took a job, and when they said, well, hey, the expectation is that you're available before and after these official hours for the needs of patients. She goes, yeah, but yesterday you told us to come in 3 hours early because the doctor didn't want to work, but now you want us to stay 2 hours late because now he feels like working. That's not what you told me when I hired in. And the hiring nurse said to her, the head nurse, she goes, well, would you have taken the job if we had told you?
I was like, see, that makes sense. No, that she
And,
made the
and she
opposite point.
said, she said, good point. I would not have, because I told you I have a side business. And the reason I took this job is for the predictable hours. So what did she
Hmm.
do? She left and went and found a job as a school nurse
Hmm.
because it's government and it's guaranteed those hours.
Sure.
And so the funny thing is, if they would have told her the truth, she would not have worked there, and they would not have spent 3 months on transition costs just to watch her find out the truth. And I love what Aldous Huxley said in The Brave New World. You will know the truth, and the truth will drive you mad. And so, in many ways, that's what happens if we hide it from people, right? Then we're like, I don't know why these people aren't reliable. I don't know, you liar. Essential number two: they aren't alone after they're hired.
Mm.
The battle is most of them aren't going to stay anyway. So why put the effort in until we know? And so then you
Yeah.
got people who
Throw
are
them in the
eating
deep
alone.
end.
They're eating alone, looking down at their lunch. It
Mm.
feels like a really bad day in the school cafeteria.
Mm.
And then in manufacturing, for example, then they're eating in their truck, right? Healthcare, they're eating in their car. And then somebody goes out and goes, "Hey, where'd Haydn go?" Well, he was eating in his truck. Well, he's not back at his station. Yeah, well, somebody go look. So they go poke their head outside the door and see my truck's gone, and they're like, "Well, I think he ghosted." Well, of course he
Yeah.
ghosted, because if you're eating alone for 4 days, then you're eating in your truck, and then you got to decide if I even want to come back.
Yeah. It's just a key turn away.
Now, absolute best predictor is, are they going to make eye contact? If not, they're going to be gone, most likely, and unless they're desperate, they're going to be gone in 3 weeks. Duh. But there are some
Yeah.
things we can do to make sure that we aren't, it's a skill is looking around. Most of
Mm.
us aren't looking around. New people take care of themselves. And why would I invest this time in you when you're probably going to leave? Okay. I love what my dentist had up for a while in his office, a sign that said, "You don't have to brush all your teeth, just the ones you want to keep."
Hmm.
Number three. So, first one, they get told the truth about the job before they get hired. Number two, they aren't alone after they're hired. Number three, essential, they don't have to guess how they're doing or who's on their side.
Mm.
The attitude that supervisors have to overcome based on when they started is typically they shouldn't need all this hand holding.
Yeah. Throw them in the pool. See how they do.
Were you ever taught swimming in the Navy? Sounds like you were.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so everybody's heard in the management circles you got to give feedback, but this is a great illustration of where traditional management does not work as well in this new life stage of emerging adulthood. People in their 20s, Gen Z, younger millennials, whatever you want to call it, it just doesn't work as well, because how they define effective feedback and how most of us who are older define effective feedback are so incredibly different. And so having some tools to better increase that, and one-on-ones that aren't awkward. The problem is most people's one-on-ones are the boss talks at least half the time. And if the
Mm.
boss doesn't zip it, sick at least 60% of the time, you will never communicate that you're on their side, nor will you really know, nor will they know how they're doing. They need to talk to you to know how they're doing. Most one-on-ones aren't really engagement oriented, people oriented one-on-ones. They're check-ins, they're project check-ins, or
Mm-hmm.
how's work going check-ins. And just two examples. Plus, we need to raise performance no matter where they are, and there's some conversations that help us do it. Those are all tools to help with that. They don't have to guess how you're doing or who's on their side. Number four, they have open conversations with their manager about work, the team, and how both are working for their life.
Hmm.
And you can tell one-on-ones will do that, but the attitude that managers have to battle is, if I let them talk openly about their frustrations will grow. But the research on this is pretty consistent and unequivocal. If you don't let them talk, for example, if you don't let them talk about the fact that they're thinking about leaving, then they probably will leave.
Mm.
If emerging adults, 18 to 28-year-olds, get a chance in this new life stage, if they get a chance, the research is really clear on this. If they get a chance to talk about and to think out loud with somebody else who's in authority, often someone who's older, if they can think out loud with somebody, not their parents, they're far more likely to be able to process decisions. And you let them talk about leaving, and they're more likely to stay. But most managers are like, oh no, now I got to go face HR with another loss.
Hmm.
So then we try to, then instead of listening cool, we listen hot. Everything gets hotter for us emotionally. We get hotter and they can see it. They can pick up the vibe that we are trying to, we're uncomfortable and we're going to try to talk them into staying. And really, what we need to do is just lean into the negative, listen cooler, bring it all down, just bring it all down and say, Sam, you're thinking that this may not be the career for you. Sam just keeps talking.
Hmm.
And you say, well, Sam, I don't know. There was a time when I didn't think I wanted to do this anymore either. So you wouldn't be alone. I'm sorry, Sam. I rarely get phone calls other than spamming on the old fashioned landline.
It's a
Let
rare
me
thing to hear that
let me
these
hang
days.
up on that. Let me hang up on that robocaller. And so if we can lean into the negatives,
Hmm.
it's 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 similar to all the good stuff on listening skills, active listening, empathic listening. I spent 33 years with Franklin Covey, so Stephen Covey is just brilliant at helping people do empathic listening. And this takes it even deeper. You cool yourself down, you lean into the negatives, and it's counterintuitive. But not only if they talk about their frustrations, will their frustrations not grow? They write on Glassdoor that my manager's great. I feel like I can, I feel like I'm
Hmm.
talking to feel like I'm talking to my uncle. I feel like I'm talking to one of my friends, and makes a big impact.
What about these things? What's so scary to managers about just listening? Because it seems simple enough to say, but what's keeping people from really acting on what you've explained so far?
We get activated, we get hot,
Hmm.
and our brain has already started to sort out all the things we should worry about
Hmm.
because we've got certain assumptions. And if why be curious if I'm about to get threatened?
Hmm. Yeah. One thing
And
I've
so, literally, the parts of our brain that help us be curious begin to shut down, and we begin to get into fight or flight mode
hmm.
when you know, instantaneously our brain goes, oh, they're going to quit. When they quit, I'm going to be in trouble. I'm going to be down somebody. Then I'm going to have to explain why I can't hold on to my people.
Hmm.
And none of this is going to be good for me. Well, there's another one. This whole generation's not reliable, mainly because it's a life stage characterized by change, choice, and freedom. And what parts of those descriptions of emerging adulthood match with staying for 20 years?
Doesn't
And
sound
so
like
I
it.
did a TED talk called Why Have What You Heard About Millennials Is Wrong, that now equally applies to Gen Z.
Hmm.
And that TEDx talk basically said when it comes to loyalty, these three characteristics of emerging adulthood much better explain why people in their 20s leave than the generational differences do. And if this is a life stage, like adolescence was the life stage identified, back in 1890s, by the way, adolescence was identified.
Hmm.
Emerging adulthood is only 20 years old, so it's brand new in terms of being identified. If these are characteristics of a real life stage, then it won't matter what generation it is, they'll all go through them.
Hmm.
There were some senior people in the military here in the United States who began, who got really bummed when I said that. They're like, well, we were hoping Gen Z would be different than millennials and want to go wherever we sent them to them with no questions asked for 30 years. I said, yeah, not so much.
Right. One thing I've learned as a coach is that you cannot be curious and judgmental simultaneously. And often I think managers, leaders, we get
Sam, that
stuck
was stupid.
in
That was a stupid comment. What do you mean by that? Yeah, you're right. It just doesn't work, does it?
exactly. And so we can get stuck in judgment because we're called to be the decision makers in a lot of instances and to defend our reasoning and all that. So, all that said, I think something so interesting about these differences between, let's say, as a millennial, we're talking about different generations, but also different life stages. And as someone with a background in psychology, I often think about uh, what another psychological researcher Eric Erickson, his stages of psychosocial development, where he breaks down the lifespan of someone
You bet.
into generally 8 stages of development, and there's generally this tension between like what am I trying to figure out. For an infant, it's can I trust my environment. For an old person past retirement, it's can I look back on my life and be glad with what I did, or do I regret a lot of things in my
Sounds
life?
like for the not infant, but the next stage, stage two, for your son, it's is my dad going to give me a flat tire? Based on our
Yeah.
previous conversation, seems like that's a major life task.
Right. The funny thing is about this framework of development is that 4 out of the 8, half of them, happen before you turn 13, as he identified it. And so getting a more clear understanding of these perhaps subgroups or just new definitions of life stages, I think could be very powerful for us to understand better.
Well, I don't, so when somebody says to me, "Hey, so what do you do now that you're on your own? What are you focused on?" And as I, as I go in the next chapter of my career, I want to help organizations actually cut turnover of
Mm.
emerging adults.
Mm.
But I don't call it emerging adults because when I ask people in a group who's heard of emerging adults, maybe 2 out of 100 will put their hands up.
Mm.
So I needed something else to say. And, when I called them 20 somethings, people said, well, that sounds ageist.
Okay.
So I call them Gen Z and younger millennials because those are 20 somethings. Those are emerging adults. And people have heard the generational language. But in this case, it is about one scoop of generational differences, the amount and type of feedback that is needed is
Mm.
a clear product of a greater focus on emotional and mental distress and illness. So Gen Z are already famous for bringing mental health discussions out into the open. That's
Interesting.
what the NCAA asked me to talk about when I spoke in one of their big annual governing meetings. 1,700 coaches, and one of the key things they wanted to talk about was what do we do with sports people who are saying I don't feel capable, I don't feel good mentally enough to play or practice.
Mm.
And our generation would have been put a splint on that and get back out there.
Right.
And so that's generational. But 2 scoops of this are about the life stage of emerging adulthood. And if you don't understand emerging adulthood, then the classic management things that work won't work for this life stage, won't work
Mm.
for these new generations. And that's why some of the very best managers you've had no longer still have high turnover with the emerging adults because the classic management stuff has to be adjusted to work as well. And so sometimes you got people scratching their heads going, I used to get awards for being a good manager. I used to be the one in the surveys that were the best. Why am I losing so many people?
Mm.
Partly that's the life stage. It's a characteristic of the life stage,
Right.
the amount of freedom. And partly what you're doing just doesn't work right. The
Mm.
You got to make some adjustments and some tweaks. So yeah, you've put it into words great.
Yeah. Let's continue with this list.
Eric Erickson, you put it into words great.
Yeah, exactly. His work. Well, let's continue with this list. What else can we
Oh, you
do?
bet. So where did we get? We got to 5. Nope, we got through 4. Number 5. Know what's going on in the business and why things are not always the way they want.
Hmm.
What do you do when what do you do when your employees are like, "Hey, I need a sick day. I got a kid who's sick. I'm going to lose my job if, what do I do?" And sometimes the answer is we got to have somebody here if we're going to hit our shipments. and price wise, we're not allowed any increases.
Hmm.
Let me quote an executive I talked to recently. He said, when we go to our OEM supplier, to our OEM customers and say, hey, we got to raise prices, we got to change our contract. What they say is labor is not a legitimate price increase conversation. The
Hmm.
cost of your materials can go up. He goes, well, great. I'll tell you what we'll do. We will drop big piles of raw materials in front of you, and we'll be fine. But if you want us to actually make something out of them, kind of got to talk about labor. So you
Right.
can be as delusional as you'd like, and I thought that was well said.
Hmm.
Sometimes, right, the organization goes, we can't pass a price increase on, and therefore we can't do what would only make sense to do if we wanted you to stay longer.
Hmm.
But we can't do it. It actually is cheaper for us to find somebody else than it is to allow you to miss a day because somebody has to take care of your kid with the flu.
As a millennial, I've experienced situations like this firsthand where my
Right.
interest and curiosity actually gets punished for asking what's going on, how does the business work, and why are we doing it this way and not the other? Doesn't make sense. And when I think about, say, as an example, just the Karate Kid way of learning things, or the just the wax on, wax off, do what I say, don't think about it. There may be power in that kind of learning style, but we think again of, say, sushi masters who take 20 years before they even try to open their own shop, studying under someone else, because you just got to learn, you just got to put in the hours, right? But for so many people like me and younger, it's not that I necessarily want to replace you or think that I'm better than I am. It's just I want to know why. I'm curious.
Yeah, I think, remember when millennials were called Generation Y? It hasn't been called that for about 6, 7 years. Millennial kind of won in the name war.
Mm,
But I said, don't call them Generation Letter Y, call them Generation WHY,
mm,
because they're the first generation that policy was no longer an answer to the why question.
mm,
It's
yeah,
not that Generation X didn't ask why a lot, but because traditionalists and boomers dominated this very small generation statistically, when the older generations would say, well, that's policy, Xers would just roll their eyes and go, well, there's no reason to keep asking if that's all they're going to tell us.
mm,
But millennials grew up asking their parents why questions that their parents would stop and answer.
mm,
Millennials would ask why questions, and their coaches at school would stop and their coaches in t-ball would stop and answer their questions.
mm,
Then they come to work where a previous generation came into the workplace where questions weren't answered except with policy. And today, when people have a lot of options, so that wax on, wax off style only works if you have no place else to go.
mm.
You are the only person who can teach me how to kick like that. So,
Right,
however you want to teach me, I will do it.
right.
On the other hand, today people have so many options. I just saw it last week, 67% of Gen X are looking for a job right now.
Wow.
They're always looking for a job.
Hmm.
So when people go, well, I don't know what's wrong with them, they're always looking for a job. And if you give them 3 non answers to a simple why question, they'll cancel you.
I believe it. If I get it's policy or because I said so, then I'm checked out.
You're not a human anymore. You're somebody's kid. And
Hmm.
this is one of the places where sometimes boomers and millennials, because, boomers raise millennials, they can click based on knowing how to approach each other. That's the time when that goes all sideways. Because I
Hmm.
said so is what a parent without patience says to a 7-year-old, not what an adult says to another adult. They want to stay for another year and a half.
Right. And this to me ties into the mentorship relationship where a good mentoring relationship, to some degree, we've set parameters and decided we're going to more or less speak to each other as colleagues,
Right?
and we're going to put aside the age difference for now in this context. But so how does all this tie into creating better mentoring experiences?
Oh, most mentors find themselves wondering how to navigate that. So in the book, I talk about co mentoring.
Hmm.
What do we both bring in this exchange of help? And long conversation around mentoring. It's a whole section of a chapter on feedback in the book, the sticking point of feedback. But one of the pieces is half of all mentoring relationships that are assigned don't work for a lot of reasons that make sense. Chemistry is not right. People don't have the same amount of commitment or time to give to it. Part of it is sometimes I want to ask the mentor things I can't ask my boss. And then the mentor is going to be like, well, I don't know if I should give you, if your boss isn't answering this, I don't
Hmm.
know that I should answer this either. So it just is awkward.
Yeah.
Plus, some of what we have to do is ask questions that don't question someone's intelligence. Not only do employees need to learn to do that, but mentors need to learn to do that as well.
Hmm. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, so we often ask questions in a way that makes it seem like I'm challenging what you're saying versus
Hmm.
I'm curious because I'm not getting it.
Right.
Yeah,
I
and
have.
and this is famous with Franklin Covey. And I think it's brilliant the idea that you start with clarifying questions and then
Hmm.
after you understand, you move to challenge questions. Just how many times you've been in a meeting where after 40 minutes, people are like, okay, okay. Well, they asked questions that felt like challenge questions when they really were asking clarifying questions. And it took 40 minutes. What could have been done in 15 took
Hmm.
40 for people to sort through the challenges when nobody was calling anybody dumb. They just asked the questions badly. They
Wow.
asked questions in a way that made people defensive, that questioned someone's intelligence, rather than saying, I'm missing something here. So I just want to be curious about why we're doing it this way. I know there's a reason why. Why are we doing it like this? I don't know. I don't understand it.
This is remarkable. Just to use that hypothetical, which is not too hypothetical. This is a real world example here, but to consider what's the man hours saved if we can cut to the quick and say in 15 minutes what we would
Oh, you
typically
bet.
take 40 minutes to say. Oh, look at the time saved, look at the money saved, the resources that get saved when we take these things into account.
Plus, John Gottman, one of the leading relationship researchers, he talks about how people begin to build up some bad feelings,
Mm,
and in love relationships, part of what we have to do is ask for what we want and then clarify things fairly quickly before it builds.
mm,
In work settings, that's so much more complicated.
mm.
And so the other downside of it is it sets us up for another meeting like that next time. Whereas if somebody can just say, oh, I'm sorry, that came across like I was disagreeing. I don't even know if I disagree or not.
Mm.
I just need some clarity. And maybe this meeting isn't the place to do it. But before we explore some ideas on how we're going to do it, I needed some clarity on why this rather than something else. Because I'm thinking, well, it would have made sense to do this. Why are we doing this? I just don't have enough clarity to know. And I don't want to throw out ideas when I've kind of got a block to this.
Mm. Now, the idea of safe spaces is a very loaded concept, but
Oh, yeah, you bet.
psychological safety, I think, perhaps is not quite as sullied as the former idea. And this sounds like a lot of what you're talking leaders can do to create more retention, create longer lasting relationships. And it's all along the lines of creating safety in relationships.
Somebody I was talking to recently said we did this big study and discovered that one of the reasons these conversations are going sideways is because of some very subtle things in metacognition.
Hmm.
I said, you're right. And the minute you say metacognition to a busy supervisor or manager, drool begins to come out of their sleeping mouth.
Right.
Yeah. And I love all the research on psychological safety. When I updated the book, I updated it in the section on meeting, the sticking point of meetings, that chapter, added some things on kind of what the foundational findings in psychological safety are all about. Because there's
Hmm.
a lot of things that are called psychological safety now that are different than in the very specific area of research is psychological safety. So I
Right.
summarize that and what you can do to promote that and why that works across generations. So I'm a fan. I just know that if we talk about how to retain people and talk about what tools do we need and what skills do we need, we can actually teach a bunch of things around metacognition with people who are awake rather than are asleep. If that makes any sense. So you're right. This is
Absolutely.
basically how do you do psychological safety for emerging adulthood
Hmm.
because they define it differently.
Hmm.
And and that's what I want from my own emerging adult kids. I'd like it to be a psychologically safe environment.
Of course.
Some days I do better at that. Some days I do worse as a parent. And I want that to be the case with the members of my team who
Hmm.
are millennial and Gen Z. I'd love it to be a psychologically safe place.
Well, and I appreciate you pointing that out, that we can make this academic and scholarly as much as we want, but if it's not, one of my favorite quotes of all time is from George Bernard Shaw, where he says, the greatest mistake in communication is thinking that it actually happened. So being able to communicate and actually get the meaning across where people take it into account, that's what's most important. Who cares about the words and terms? But yeah, I want to hear more about wrapping up this list that you have.
Yeah, so number 5, we've been talking about they don't know what's going on in the business and why things are not always the way they want. And then number 6, they have clear conversations with their manager about the future.
Hmm.
Boy, why do managers avoid it? For good reason. It's better to avoid talking about their career path because they may not like the answers and will leave. One HR director in Pittsburgh pulled me over and goes, "You weren't just being smart alecky.
Hmm.
HR does not do recruiting for our company. And so there's a disconnect between what recruiters say and what people expect. So when they come into my office and want to talk about their career path, and I know there isn't one, I just fake an aneurysm." That was what she said. I grab my head and fall out of my seat. Because if I
Wow.
can postpone the conversation for another 6 months, they'll stay. When we have it and they find out that they were schnookered, then they go. But most organizations are not quite as bad as lying about a career path in the recruiting process. But when I talk to employee resource groups for companies, kind of their younger professionals, millennial employee resource groups, and they go, "Well, hey, we'd like you to talk about your book." And I said, "Love to." But the topic I get asked the most is how do I have a conversation with my manager about my career path? And they all go, "Yeah, that one. That's what we
Hmm.
talk about in our group all the time." But I said, matter of fact, it works best if you invite your managers to come. And we'll talk about why it's hard to talk about, and we'll talk about how you talk about it, and then I'll give you a chance to talk about it. They're like, "That'd be great." And there's some really good reasons why managers are reluctant because sometimes people do leave. On the other hand, and then employees don't know how to talk about their career path without communicating, "I'm thinking about leaving."
Right.
So that's a place, Sam, where your point about being punished for curiosity comes out in spades. Wow, that is an old phrase, isn't it? You got to be a card player or do a lot of gardening and digging for things to come out in spades. But anyway, the people are like, "I don't know how to bring it up to my boss without them immediately listening hot, going to places that
Hmm.
are not where I mean to go with this." And so there are some things that can, make that better. But one of the things we do as a manager is have an opportunity map because today organizations are no longer Donkey Kong,
Hmm.
where you climb these things, do these things, and then you get Princess Peach. Today they're much more like the game Mist, where you travel all over the island for a while, then you go over another part of the island, then another part of the island, and then somebody goes, "Well, hey, I met them when they were working in this part of the island. We ought to
Oh,
give
see,
them a
Hayden,
look."
now you've really dated yourself, because Myst is something my parents played.
You bet, because I'm that old. You name another non-shooter, non-scoring game where you go explain stuff, right? Even Meat Boy is still
Okay,
about winning.
Sure, sure.
How's that? How's that throwing in Meat
That's
Boy?
that's more recent than missed. Yes, I'll give that. Very interesting. Yes, because I'll say again, personal experience. When I chose to pursue an MBA while I was employed and growing my career, when that decision was made, I was looked at differently and not in a good way, because I guess it was interpreted as I'm gunning for someone's position. I'm going to be distracted, which being distracted as far as that goes, pursuing a master's in business administration, you'd think they'd be interested in trying to leverage the best theories and practices that I'm learning every week. But sometimes it just, people don't see it the same way.
Yeah, you bet. That's a little more based on strengths or styles
Mm.
or approaches, whatever tools you use to sort that out. People who are very task oriented or people who are very action oriented are often like, the last thing I need is more theories. Last thing I need is MBA boy bringing me in more stuff for us to chat about.
Sure. Yeah. No, that's definitely true. Wow. And so, what are
All right,
the final few things?
the last ones. There's only one more. So number
Okay.
6, they have clear conversations with their manager about their future.
Right.
And even if their manager has to say, here are the opportunities. The skill is, how do you keep people motivated when you don't have what they think they want as fast as they want it? All right.
Mm.
So what can you do to keep them motivated when career progression isn't that? Because let, let's face it, with people working longer and living longer and people having better health, not everybody, but some having better health, your boss probably isn't going to leave or pass on into the great beyond. So I always joke to bosses, hey, you think your employee has dropped some marinara on their shirt? You need to get close enough to it to see if it's not brake fluid. Because if their only way up is to tamper with your brakes, you need to pump them before you leave the lot. And it's dark, I know, but slightly true. The last one, the last essential that'll cut turnover, it'll work,
Mm.
is they know they will be welcome back and who they can refer.
Wow.
So I was talking to somebody about this when he goes, yeah, there was a big debate in our organization. It was a pharmaceutical company about whether or not we should hire people back. Big debate we had for years. And actually, if you're in a warehouse, for example, a high turnover place, you want the names of the employees you liked after they left, and you want their permission to email them or better yet, text them for a couple of reasons. One, a lot of times emerging adults move someplace else and then fall in love, move out of emerging adulthood into young adulthood, have a baby or two, and come back to where they grew up, where their family members are.
Sure.
So you want to be the first job they think about when they move closer to their parents to get help with child rearing. So why would you want them not to remember you? You want
Mm.
to stay in contact with them. It is your mailing list. You are just like you do with the mailing list in marketing. You are keeping front of mind with these people so that you're the first spot they think of.
Mm.
Now they may be farther along in their life stages. They may need more money. You may not be the place they would take into account. They may not want 18 or 20 bucks an hour. Fair enough.
Sure.
But you're top of mind. In that way, you can text them and say, hey, we really liked it when you worked here. Who else do you know that we would also like? What is
Mm.
your best source of referrals that you don't have to screen out too much? It's people that liked working there and that you liked, who left because things came up in their life and they wanted to do something else.
Yeah.
So one of the things we mess up for lower turnover is they don't think we'll welcome them back and who they can refer to the plant. So when they are going to leave, what do we do to make hiring easier? And we want them, just like when you stage a home on all those television shows,
Mm.
we want them to be able to think about who would be good in some different spots. So one of the things a manager can do when they're leaving is saying, well, hey, who do you think works best here in this spot or this spot or this spot? And you actually get them staging the rooms of the house, so to speak, in the organization or plant or hospital. retail
Hmm.
environment. You think about the different spots and what kind of person does best there, so that they've already figured out their second life persona. And see, little newer technology.
Second life boy.
You're already, not that I'm bitter, not that I'm bitter. Okay, they're already thinking about the kind of person that would fit. So when you ask them, you've already had a conversation, and they're already thought about the kind of people that fit best,
Hmm.
and they're already bringing you pre-screened people. Because
Sure.
when you're at 3% unemployment, there are a lot of reasons why you might not want to hire 2% of that 3%.
Hmm.
Sometimes they're called unhireable
Fair. Yeah.
or less desirable. And that means everybody's fighting over 1% of people.
Hmm. That makes sense. Now, to wrap my head around this, it sounds like there's no need to make this any more complicated than it has to be in terms of making sure someone feels welcome coming back or welcome giving a referral to the company. But in one way that you phrased it, it felt like, is there anyone but perhaps a founder CEO that has the time to think out so far ahead strategically to do anything more than, man, what am I going to do for my next quarterly report? I don't have the wherewithal to think about how am I going to do all this.
Well, think about that warehouse manager, since we've been,
Right.
talking about that conversation. Think about that where a manager is like, I had two absentees today and two people are quit. I may be running a forklift so we can get this stuff shipped. How am I going to have this conversation? Well, part of it is if you're having one-on-ones on the days when it's not complete chaos, you're already beginning to build
Mm,
that. I don't know. I got to find something that's better, but it's that persona, that
mm,
a second life persona. What does that spot look like? You're already having those conversations, right? Hey, what do you think makes a good person? What do you think makes a good person in the job you're doing? You're already having those conversations. So you do a little bit at a time. And then it's not hard to go, hey, we really liked having you here. Understand that you need this. Or, the person you kiss got a different job. So in order to take care of your 6-month old, you're going to need to switch. You're going to have to find a job where you can switch shifts, and we don't have a spot for that part of the week.
mm,
And that's too bad. Hey, if your things change, come back, look us up.
yeah.
And this is a 3-minute conversation as you're saying goodbye to them. Do you mind me texting you or emailing? Do you mind us emailing you? And just from time to time, first of all, hey, we liked having you here, letting you know kind of what we're doing. But more than that, if it's retail, and sometimes we send out coupons to past
Mm,
employees we really like. Warehouses are often retail, not always, but often. A coupon or two does not help people, does not hurt for people recommending you. And then lastly, can we text you from time to time to see if you know anybody who needs a job that fit good?
mm,
Yeah, yeah, sure. And if they say no, I'd rather you not. You're like, okay, cool.
mm,
But what are managers worried about? They're worried that, well, they're leaving because they don't like it here and they'll never come back or refer people. No, they're leaving because it doesn't fit something in their life. And
mm,
emerging adults are characterized by freedom, change, and choice.
mm. Wow. So to begin to wrap this all together,
Yeah.
what I'm hearing is we have these different generational perspectives, we have different life stages. Emerging adulthood, a huge thing to understand for employers and managers right now. But in terms of these tips, these essentials for reducing turnover, the big things I'm picking out from this on top of the specific tips is keep it simple, keep it from getting hot. I was gonna say keep it cool, but you don't have to be a robot either. I would assume, but keeping things authentic, keeping it simple is important.
You bet. Because a robot, AI is, when AI does counseling, yes, you must be feeling sad about that. When you're keeping it cool, sometimes all you have to say is, oh,
Hmm.
huh, yeah, that's hard. Occasionally I know so many people who are sorting that out right now.
Mm.
And everybody goes, wow, Hayden is so cool to work for. I
Mm.
thought he'd be a little freaked out. And in my own head, I may be going, oh, doggone it.
Sure.
But instead, we just cool ourselves down instead of going hot.
Mm.
And that makes it all opens up huge amounts of possibilities because then our brain allows us to be curious. And when we're curious, they feel like we're taking seriously as a human being, as a person. We care about them more than the company. We're on their side. And
Mm.
then we say, yeah, I wish we could do these things. Here's why we have this policy, or here's why we can't.
Wow. Practicing curiosity. That's the big takeaway for me here. That's fantastic. Hayden, as we wrap up, everything, one thing I ask every guest, since this is the Courage Coach for Executives podcast, is what does courage mean to you?
Courage means to me that you're scared and it doesn't matter that much.
Hmm.
Yeah, sometimes sociopaths are not scared where they could be, and they
True.
do a lot of damage.
Hmm.
And but when human beings are scared about things, they show courage when they just keep going, when they go do what needs to be done anyway. And I think it really applies to staying cool in conversations.
Right.
It takes courage. It takes courage to allow an employee you really value or an employee you're desperate to keep because you know what you're going to do on Thursday. It takes courage to then care more about them than you do about yourself so that they know you do and decide they want to keep playing with somebody that cares more about them than they do themselves, then they would go after an opportunity that pays 10% more.
Hmm. Absolutely. Wow. Well, Hayden Shaw, thank you for joining us on the show.
Fun conversation. Thanks for
Yeah.
talking about thanks for talking about things that can make a big difference. Well, that any organization can do.
Hmm.
We may not have control over all the levers of turnover, but any
Hmm.
organization can do these things.
Yes, absolutely. Well, I'm Sam, the Courage Coach for Executives, and remember, it starts with you.